Hello everyone. The day James returns to Tu Diep from Cambodia, will she call him Dad? The day James finally returns from Cambodia, carrying with him all the scars of distance and longing. A question lingers in the air. Will Tu Diep's little girl look into his eyes and call him Dad? In that single word lies a lifetime of healing, love, and the promise of a family reborn. The evening sky glowed in shades of orange and violet, the kind of sunset that carried both hope and sorrow in its colors. Tu Diep stood by the edge of the small garden, her hands brushing over the tender leaves of the vegetables she had nurtured through countless days of waiting. The wind whispered through the bamboo, carrying with it the memory of promises once made. Somewhere in her heart, she wondered if those promises would ever be fulfilled. For months, James had vanished into the silence of Cambodia, a land far from the quiet village where Diep raised their daughter, Nhi. The world called him a CEO, a man of great ambition, but to her and to the little girl with bright eyes, he was not a figure of power. He was simply the one who had promised to come back, to sit at the table again, and to be more than a fleeting shadow in their lives. Nhi tugged at her mother's hand, her voice soft but piercing. "Mom, will Uncle James come today?" Diep swallowed the ache in her chest and forced a smile. "Maybe, sweetheart. Maybe today," she said it as if repeating the words might make them true. But inside, her doubts grew louder. If he returned, what would Nhi call him? Would the word Dad rise naturally from her lips? Or would the distance of absence build walls no love could climb? Far away, James sat on the plain, his reflection trembling against the small window. Cambodia had been a cage of endless negotiations, battles with shadows of betrayal, and the search for redemption. He had faced ruin, temptation to surrender, and nights where despair seemed his only companion. Yet through it all, one vision sustained him: the thought of returning to Diep and Nhi, to reclaim not his wealth, but his family. The plane landed. His heart pounded as though it had forgotten how to rest. He carried no grand gifts, no jewels, no proof of victory, only the weight of longing and the hope that it would be enough. When he finally reached the village, the sight of Diep waiting by the garden nearly brought him to his knees. Her eyes widened, not with surprise, but with the unspoken storm of emotions she had hidden for too long. He wanted to speak, to explain, to beg forgiveness, but his words died when Nhi peeked out from behind her mother. The little girl stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with innocence yet touched with questions she was too young to voice. James bent down, trembling, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Nhi, it's me." The silence stretched. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then Nhi stepped forward, hesitant but brave, and placed her tiny hand into his. Her lips parted, and with a voice as fragile as it was powerful, she asked, "Are you my dad?" James's eyes burned with tears. In that instant, he realized the answer was not his to give, it was hers to decide. All he could do was hold her hand tighter, praying that one day, the word he longed to hear would come, not from obligation, but from love. And Diep, standing there with tears in her eyes, understood that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not a perfect one, not one without scars, but one where the past could be forgiven, and the future rebuilt meal by meal, promise by promise, heart to heart. James knelt in the fading light, the soil cool beneath his knees. He held Nhi's small hand as if it were the most fragile treasure in the world. His lips trembled with words he could not shape. Behind him, the crickets had begun their nightly chorus, filling the silence with an aching reminder that time had already stolen too much from them. Tu Diep finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "You should come inside. It's getting cold." Her words were simple, but James could hear the guardedness in them, a shield built from months of solitude and disappointment. Still, she turned and walked toward the small house, and that was enough an invitation, however fragile. Inside, the room smelled of warm rice and fresh herbs. On the wooden table stood a humble meal, stir-fried vegetables, a bowl of soup, and rice still steaming. It was nothing like the feasts James had once hosted in shining city towers, but his chest tightened because this was what he had missed day and night. Nee climbed onto her seat, her eyes never leaving him. James sat opposite, his hands awkwardly folded, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace. Diep placed a bowl in front of him without a word. For a moment, he could not lift his chopsticks. He wanted to memorize everything: the flicker of the oil lamp, the way Diep's hair fell loosely around her shoulders, the sound of Nee's soft laughter. "Eat, Dad," Nee suddenly said, almost without realizing. The words slipped from her lips naturally, like a secret she had been holding for too long. James froze, his vision blurred, and he lowered his head quickly, afraid they would see the tears threatening to spill. That single word was heavier than any crown, more precious than any fortune he had ever held. Diep looked at him quietly. She did not smile, but her eyes softened just a little. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Forgiveness was not a gift given in one night. It had to be earned, moment by moment. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. James lifted his bowl, his hands still shaking, and whispered, "Thank you for this meal and for this chance." He ate slowly, savoring every bite as though it were the first and last. That night, under the quiet roof of the small home, James did not sleep. He lay awake listening to the sound of Nee's breathing and Diep's gentle movements in the next room. He promised himself that no matter what storms awaited outside, no matter what battles in business or past debts returned to haunt him, he would never again let this home slip through his fingers. Because at last, he understood, to be called Dad was not a title to demand, it was a promise to keep, every single day. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently through the thin curtains. James rose early, long before Diep stirred, and stepped outside into the crisp dawn air. The fields stretched endlessly, green and golden, carrying the smell of earth and dew. For years he had lived in boardrooms and airports, places where the air was heavy with ambition. But here, standing on the worn path before Diep's home, he felt a strange peace and a heavy weight of responsibility. He heard laughter behind him. Turning, he saw Nee running barefoot toward the chicken coop, her small hands holding a basket too big for her. "Careful," James called, his voice more tender than he expected. She glanced back at him and giggled, as if to say she would not fall as long as he was watching. Diep came out shortly after, tying her hair back with quiet efficiency. She did not greet him, but went straight to the small garden, picking vegetables for breakfast. James approached slowly, his heart pounding with every step. "Diep," he said softly. She did not look up, only continued picking. "I know words can't fix the time I was gone, but let me help you now. Let me be part of this." Finally, she looked at him, her eyes neither warm nor cold, but cautious. "Actions, James. Nee doesn't need promises anymore. She needs presence." Those words cut him deeper than any rival's betrayal, yet they also became his anchor. He took the basket from her hands without asking, kneeling down to gather the remaining herbs. His suit from Cambodia felt useless here. His hands, once skilled only with contracts and pens, now dirtied themselves willingly. Days passed, and James stayed. He helped Nee with her lessons, clumsy at first but patient. He carried water, repaired the broken fence, and shared meals without ever rushing away to phone calls or meetings. The neighbors whispered, some in surprise, some in disbelief that the once untouchable CEO was now living like a farmer. But James no longer cared. At night, when Nee was asleep, He and Diep would sit outside under the stars. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The silence was no longer sharp. It was slowly becoming a bridge. One evening, she finally asked, "Why Cambodia?" James inhaled deeply. His voice was low, raw. "I was running from enemies, from the ruins of my company, from myself. But every night, no matter where I went, I saw your face and knees. I realized I wasn't escaping, I was abandoning. And that's something I will regret until my last breath." Diep's eyes glistened, but she turned away before he could see the tears slip down. She didn't forgive him, not yet. But her heart, long frozen, was beginning to thaw. For the first time, James believed he might truly earn the word dad, not through titles or wealth, but through the steady rhythm of love, patience, and presence. Yet, as peace returned to his heart, the shadow of his past still lingered. The enemies he had left behind in Cambodia had not forgotten him, and one night, as the wind howled against the fragile windows, a distant phone call reached James. A voice he thought silenced whispered, "You can't hide in the fields forever, James. We will come for what is ours." Life has a way of testing us through separation, regret, and the weight of broken promises. James's return to Diep and Nhi after years away is more than a story of a man coming back from Cambodia. It is the story of how love, when neglected, demands repair, and how the bonds of family can only be rebuilt through patience and presence. The first lesson is about time. Time lost cannot be returned, but it can be redeemed. James could not undo the nights Diep spent alone or the mornings Nhi grew without his guidance. Yet, by choosing to stay, to share simple meals, and to walk in the fields with them, he showed that even the smallest gestures of consistency can begin to heal old wounds. The second lesson is about love's true form. Love is not measured in grand promises or material wealth, but in attention, in listening, and in being there when we are needed. Diep reminded James that words mean little without action. Her quiet strength teaches us that forgiveness is not given freely, it is earned through proof of change. The third lesson comes from Nhi. Her innocence shows us that children do not judge the past as adults do. What she longed for most was not money or gifts, but the simple right to call someone dad with trust in her heart. She teaches us that love, when it is pure, needs only presence and care to grow. Finally, the story tells us that redemption is possible, but it comes with humility. James, once a powerful CEO, had to kneel in the dirt to carry water, to learn the rhythms of a life far from his office towers. In doing so, he discovered a deeper strength, the strength to love honestly, to live faithfully, and to rebuild what had once been broken. The lesson is clear. We may wander, we may stumble, and we may even disappear for a time. But when we return, our greatest responsibility is not to prove our success to the world, but to prove our love to the ones who waited for us.